So the aims of this workshop, first, we're going to look at understanding the balance between stress and recovery. And by stress, I mean how hard the sessions are and what the stress is induced by those sessions. And then recovery, how much easy or recovery days do we need after those hard sessions, and what should a recovery or an easy day look like for the individual. And this is part of managing training loads, getting that the balance right between stressful enough to cause adaptations, but enough recovery so that we can absorb those adaptations and lead to increases to performance. And then at the end, we're gonna look at building a training program. So we're gonna wrap it all together, all the content from part 1 and from part 2 of a webinar, and we'll look at how we can apply this into building a training program. What should a week look like? What should a week look like and we'll go through a couple of examples there. So firstly then, how important is recovery? Why do we need recovery? What does recovery look like? In terms of recovery, we're talking about the easy days or the recovery days after the hard sessions, and how do we balance them? What should those days look like? And how should they be balanced in proportion to the hard sessions? So we're not talking about recovery modalities such as sleep or nutrition, which are all really important. We're going to look at the training aspects of recovery and what should an easy day look like. So first, why do we need recovery? And to explain that, I'm going to use this graph here. So don't get put off by graphs if you're not a scientist or a mathematician. I'm going to talk you through it all and hopefully break it down to really easy to understand. So on the bottom here, this is time. So this is time 0, and this is time in hours and days. It doesn't really matter about what the scale is. And then on the side here, we've got change from baseline. So this is our baseline values. This is our starting point, and then this is positive and this is negative. And then we've got 3 curves. We've got a fitness curve, a fatigue curve, and a performance curve. So this is time 0, and this is just after we've done a hard session. So a session in zone 3, zone 4, zone 5, or zone 6. So those hard intensity zones that we talked about in part 1 of this webinar. And then we've got the 3 curves, which are the responses to that intensities, that hard session. So if we go through fitness first, straight after that hard session, we're going to start to see increases in fitness. And fitness or training adaptations can be broken down in their simplest form to just increases in protein expression or an upregulation of protein synthesis. So all training adaptations can be broken down into increases in protein synthesis. And protein isn't just muscle. Protein makes up our whole body effectively. So for example, after an aerobic session, so it might challenge us aerobically, so it might be a zone 4 sessions or zone 5 session, we're using quite a high proportion of our aerobic capacity. There's a lot of aerobic metabolism going on. We might see an increase in the proteins that make up mitochondria. So mitochondria are the powerhouses of the cells. They're where we release energy from fats and from carbohydrates, and then that energy is used to fuel our running. So in response to a aerobic session, we might get an increase in the proteins that make up a mitochondria, and that's going to lead us to have a better lactate threshold, a better lactate turn point, and potentially a better running economy. On the other hand, we might have, in response to an anaerobic session, so a zone 6 session, where we're generating lots of lactate, we might get an increase in the proteins that are responsible for anaerobic metabolism. So the enzymes that catalyze the reactions that lead to anaerobic metabolism. And so we'll get a better anaerobic capacity. So either way, this protein expression takes time. So we don't just get fitter straight away. It's going to happen over the hours and days following a training session. So if you look at the fitness curve again, it slowly increases until it reaches a plateau. And that's where all the training adaptation that's going to happen has happened. And then if we don't do another hard session, the fitness is then going to drop off and start to return to baseline. And this is because these proteins need to be constantly, they're constantly being cycled through. They've only got a short shelf life. They don't last forever. So if you're not providing a stimulus to increase protein upregulation, protein synthesis, then we're going to slowly lose those adaptations. Then we've got the fatigue curve. So after a hard session, there's obviously going to be some fatigue. And there's lots of things that can cause fatigue, things like glycogen depletion in the muscles. You might have muscle damage, or you might have this inside the muscle fibers themselves. There may be there might have been a acidification within the muscles, and that needs to be put back, and homeostasis needs to be restored. So there's lots of things that can cause fatigue. So the fatigue is going to be greatest probably in the 24 to 48 hours post-exercise, and then it's slowly going to reduce and disseminate and come back to baseline values. So the performance curve, then our last curve, is just the difference between the fitness that we've gained, the training adaptations we've gained, and the amount of fatigue there is within the system, so how much fatigue the athlete has. So to start off with, there's a reduction in performance capability. So there might be increased fitness, but actually if they went out to do a time trial or they went to do a race, they wouldn't be able to perform very well because they're also carrying lots of fatigue from that last hard session. So we're going to reach, the performance is going to decrease to start with in the 24 to 48 hours post after a hard session. But then as fatigue starts to disseminate and the fitness adaptations start to outweigh that fatigue, we now return back to baseline, and there's going to be an overshoot, a supercompensation, and an increase in performance. And again, if there's not another training stimulus in the next period of time, then the performance is going to return back to that baseline values. So hopefully that makes sense. We've got a fitness curve, a fatigue curve, and a performance curve, which is just the difference between the fitness and the adaptations that we've gained and the fatigue that's left from that hard session. So obviously that's why we need recovery. If we didn't have recovery, then we wouldn't be getting all of our training adaptations. So if we did our next session here, then we've not maximized our training adaptations, and we're also going to be left with lots of fatigue. We'll talk about that a little bit more in the next few slides. So that's why we need recovery, but what does a recovery day look like? And you might have remember from part 1 of this webinar that actually the recovery days and the easy days should be in the zone 1 and zone 2 intensities zones. So that's below the lactate threshold. So that's where lactate has not gone up above baseline values. You could have a really easy conversation, and heart rate staying quite low. So we want to stay in those zone 1 and zone 2 zones and not end up in zone 3, which induces a lot more stress just by going a little bit harder. And that's going to interfere with the training adaptations, that fitness curve, and it's also going to induce more fatigue. So instead of fatigue disappearing as we recover, we're going to confound it, and there's going to be more fatigue. And this is another graph here just to show, to demonstrate why it's really important that we stay below the lactate threshold. So this is the recovery periods after a number of different training sessions. So here it's 5 minutes after the exercise, and we're looking at 5 minutes to 4 hours after a training session. And we've got 4 different training sessions. We've got a easy 1 hour run below the lactate threshold, so zone 2. Then we've got an easy 2 hour run at the same intensity, but still easy. We've got a threshold one, which is zone 3. So that's between the lactate threshold but below the lactate turn point. And then we've got another one, which is a hard session, which is above the lactate turn point. So that's a zone 4 session. But then here on the side, we've got heart rate variability. And heart rate variability is just a way of measuring how much stress the body is under. So if the heart rate variability is high, we're in a restful state. It's like the rest and digest state, or a high parasympathetic nervous system activity. So that's a high heart rate variability is suggesting that we're recovered, we're rested, the body's not under that much stress. A low heart rate variability, then on the other hand, is the sign that we're in a flight or fight mode, or a high sympathetic nervous system activity. And this is associated with things like stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol. And it's saying that the body's in a stressful state. It's been thrown away from homeostasis. We've gone away from those baseline values that we normally maintain, such as pH and heart rate, etc. So for both the 1 hour and the 2 hour easy zone 2 sessions, heart rate variability stays really high during the recovery. It's not really changed from baseline. And so for actually even the 2 hour session was still not that stressful in the body if the intensity was maintained low enough. And these are probably athletes that are well accustomed to running 2 hours. So they're adapted to running for 2 hours, but it's not stressing the body that much at a systemic level, at a whole body level. On the other hand, the zone 3 and the zone 4 sessions, they've both led to a big reduction in heart rate variability. And so there's lots of stress hormones going around the body. There's the adrenaline, cortisol. And this is going to this will lead to training adaptations, but also it's going to lead to lots of fatigue, and it's going to stress the body. And the thing is, with the zone 3 and the zone 4 traces both look really similar. So the zone 3 is this one on the bottom with the three black triangles, and you see it starts to return to baseline within about 60 minutes after the exercise bout. But for a significant period of time, it's reduced. And that's exactly the same as the zone 4 session. So despite zone 3 being only slightly harder than zone 2, it leads to quite a different response within the body. It's much more stressful, and this is going to interfere with training adaptations if we're doing a zone 3 session instead of a zone 2 session. So if we started aim to do a zone 2 session, but we found ourselves actually going a bit too hard, we're pushing the pace too much, then this is going to lead to a stress response, which is going to inhibit the recovery process and those training adaptations that we mentioned earlier. So to summarize, then a recovery day must be in those zone 1 and zone 2 intensities. And for some people, it might be a complete day off. If you're new to running and just going out for an easy run is still quite a stressful experience, then actually it might need to be a day off completely, and actually just running 3 days a week or 4 days a week with days off between is enough. But actually for the more experienced athlete, doing easy zone 1 and zone 2 training sessions will allow you to get a good volume of work in. And remember, volume is a really good predictor of performance, which we covered in the first webinar. So it allows us to get some good volume of training in without really stressing the body. So yeah, that's what a recovery day should look like: easy or completely off, and making sure that if we're going to go for a run, that we're staying below the lactate threshold, and that we're in a nice, comfortable zone. So we're going to move on to looking at the balance between the stress and recovery. So this is sort of how many easy days do we need to absorb those hard training sessions, and to make sure that the training adaptations has completely taken place, and that the fatigue has left the system as well. So to do that, we've got a similar curve to earlier. This is just for performance. We've got rid of the fitness and the fatigue. We've just left with the performance curve. And obviously, smile face, we're getting better, performance is improving, and happy face, performance is decreasing. So again, this is after a hard session. After a hard session, we're left with lots of fatigue. But then as the fatigue starts to disseminate and training adaptations and fitness improvements outweigh that fatigue, we start to see an increase in performance, and that's going to lead to an increase in performance above where we started. And then if we do another session there, the same thing will happen again. We'll have some fatigue, but then the training adaptations will outweigh that fatigue. And now we've got an even better performance level. And that can continue and continue again. And actually, now we've got a considerably improved performance compared to where we started. So we started down here, and our performance has increased up to this level. So this is an example of where there's a good balance between the hard sessions and the easy sessions. We're absorbing each training session and getting the most out of the training adaptations that come from that session. And we're seeing a nice linear increase in performance. So that's what we should all be after. That's what a great model of stress and recovery should look like. But what happens if we have insufficient recovery or excessive stress? So we've got the same curve here. We've got fatigue after a hard session, and then we're starting to recover. Performance is starting to get back to baseline values as those training adaptations outweigh the fatigue. But now, instead of doing our next session here, we're doing it a day early. Let's say we're taking a day less than we actually need. So now we're doing our next session here. So now fatigue's going to kick in again. And then we're going to start getting more training adaptations, and performance is going to start to improve back to baseline values. But again, we undercut recovery. Again, we take a day less recovery than we need. And the same thing's going to happen. We're going to get a reduction in performance and reduction in performance again, and reduction in performance. And now, we started here, and despite doing all of these sessions, our performance level is now down here. And that's because we're now getting excessive fatigue in the system. We're not having enough time to absorb all that training. And so we've got a reduction in performance. And if we now had 3 or 4 or 5 days of really easy training, our performance levels might start to improve back up to baseline. But it's risky. We're in a high risk state with lots of fatigue in the system. That's going to increase the risk of overtraining, of picking up injuries, etc. So it's not ideal. So that's what happens to us in insufficient recovery. But it could also be an excess stress. So for example, in a club setting, we normally have fixed training nights, don't we? It might be a Monday and a Thursday, or it could be a Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday. And they're normally fixed. The athletes turn up on that day to do a hard session. So let's take the Monday, Thursday example. So that's a good, that gives us 2 easy days between the hard sessions, which is good. But what if we do a session on the Monday, which is more challenging than we're used to? And actually, instead of taking 2 days to recover, it takes 4 days to recover. Well, that means that when we get to Thursday, then we're still going to be in a stressful state. We won't have recovered fully. And this could result in a curve like this if we keep doing sessions that are too hard for that fixed recovery time. So that's just something to consider. If you've got a Monday, Thursday set up, then actually maybe your hardest session of the week should be on the Thursday, because that gives you longer. That gives you the Friday, the Saturday, and the Sunday to recover before coming back again on the Monday. So it's just to be that some sessions are going to take more recovery than others. If it's just a reasonably controlled session, then you might be recovered within the day or 2 days. If it's a really quite hard session, it may take 3 or 4, even 5 days to recover if it's a really challenging, really big session. So that's just something to bear in mind when you're planning your training schedule. Make sure that the amount of recovery you have is proportional to the stressfulness of the session. So we can also have excessive recovery. And here we get the fatigue, we then get the training adaptations and an increase in performance. But actually now we've not done another training session for quite a while, and we're starting to go back to baseline values. And if we keep doing that, then we're gonna, well, despite doing multiple training sessions, we're going to see no increase in performance because we've just waited too long. We've not stressed the system frequently enough. And this might be great. This might, if you're in for example, if you're in a track season and you just want to maintain your fitness levels without building up too much fatigue, then this is great because you're not ever going to be in a big wells of fatigue. You can be able to race quite frequently, and you're just looking to maintain your fitness so that you can have a prolonged season. So this can be really good. On the other side, we have insufficient stress, and that's a similar curve. But here, the session that the athlete did wasn't that stressful. So they developed a bit of fatigue, and then they'll recover. Performance will go up back to baseline levels as protein synthesis, but only enough to get them back to their performance level. And if this happens consecutively, then you will see an athlete that's still training, but there's a plateau. And you can quite often see this with an athlete who's suddenly joins a club. They start doing some structured training, and over the first 6 months to a year, they'll see big improvements in performance. But then they'll start to plateau. That's because they've already adapted to the training load they're doing. If they're doing the same sessions each week and they're running the same amount of miles each week, then actually they're probably not going to improve much more. Something needs to change. They either need to run more volume, or they need to increase the volume of the hard sessions. Something needs to train for them to induce a new stress, which is going to stimulate a greater performance gain. So more training adaptations. So to summarize then, if we want to build fitness, it's just not just one session. We need to accumulate training. So multiple training sessions are what lead to building fitness. But the recovery needs to also be really important. So we need a recovery. The amount of recovery needs to be proportional to the toughness of the session. So if there's lots of fatigue and it's been a really stressful session, then we're going to need much more recovery than a session that was only moderately hard. And then recovery is relative. As I said earlier, some people might need a complete day off. Some people may go for a single easy run. And then if going to a more experienced runner, they still might run twice a day. They might do 10 miles in the morning and 6 miles in the evening, but actually they'll make sure the intensity is really comfortable and that it will be well below the lactate threshold. Lactate will be at a steady state. It won't have gone up above baseline. Breathing will be nice and comfortable. Heart rate will be staying nice and low. And that will mean that we don't invoke a stress response. So then we're going to move on to determining your training load. So training load is basically just how stressful, how much stress the athlete is being placed under. So it sort of encompasses a whole, instead of just looking at a single session, we can look at a whole week, and we can look at how much easy running they're doing, how much intensity they're doing, and all of that together combined will determine the training load that the athlete is experiencing. And there's lots of different ways of measuring training loads. Some in Training Peaks, it comes up with a score that it gives you. You could look at time in different training zones, but there's no real gold standard. And that's one of the objectives of my PhD, is to sort of explore training load a bit more. But basically, it's just how much stress an athlete is being put under. So it's very individual. It's obviously a more experienced athlete will be able to tolerate a higher training load than one who is newer to running. But on this graph here, we'll look at that now. We've got training load on the bottom, so a low load down here and high load up here. And then we've got a response here. So this is looking at the effects of the training load. If we look at this green line, this is the positive effects, or we could think of it as fitness gains or training adaptations or performance. So with a low training load, so that could be a low volume training program with just a little bit of intensity in there, then you're going to see just modest improvements in performance. You'll get some training adaptations, but they're not going to be massive. You're not going to see big improvements in performance. And as you increase the training load, the graph now the line becomes quite linear, and we're seeing nice improvements with performance. So an increase in training load leads to in proportional increase in performance. And as loads start to increase, we're now getting quite high, and we start to see a plateau in the positive effects. And then as training load becomes excessive, then actually we start to see a decrease in performance, because like we were talking about earlier, there's too much fatigue, too much stress in the system, and an athlete just can't recover, they can't adapt. So that's the positive effects. There's also a side effects or a toxic effects to training loads. So with low training loads, there's little risk of side effects, and by side effects I mean injury risk or risk of fatigue, risk of picking up an illness or an infection, or the risk of overtraining. So at low training loads, there's a little risk of these negative side effects, but as this increases, there's also a proportional increase in the risk of injury and illness. And then when it gets to a certain point where you're almost guaranteed that at some point something is going to happen, so you're gonna not cope with the training, you're almost certainly going to get ill or develop excessive fatigue, and it's just not going to be sustainable. So for most people, they probably want to spend their time in the blue zone here. So an example of a track athlete who's not bothered about cross country or indoors, they just want to race well over 800 and 1500 meters in the summer, then for most of their winter, they're going to want to spend the time here, where they're getting a really good amount of positive adaptation and training response, but there's low risk of side effects. So that's a really good place to be. But there probably are some times where you want to be in this red box here, depending on the athlete you are. This is probably a senior athlete who's maybe looking to make a championship team, or they're just really driven and they're trying to get the most out of themselves. And there might be some times where you want to spend some time here. So an example could be a marathon runner who in the last 6 weeks before their taper, they might want to be a bit closer to this red zone here, where they'll get a few more percentage points in improvement in performance, which can make quite a big difference. But they've also got to appreciate that this spending time here isn't sustainable. You can't spend a lot of time really pushing the limits of how much training load you can tolerate, because actually there's a big risk of adverse effects, and athletes have got to do their best to manage that, to make sure they're eating really well, they're getting enough sleep, that they're managing their strength and conditioning sessions, etc. But there's always going to be that risk there as you start to get towards the limit of the training loads that you can sustain. So then the question then is, how do you monitor your own training loads? And the best way might be just to monitor how you feel. So if you're in this blue zone here, you obviously feel like you're doing some training. You'll feel tired sometimes, but actually most of the time you should feel all right. You're going to obviously have some fatigue after your hard sessions, but by the time you get to your next hard session, you've recovered and you're ready to go again, and you're consistently doing good quality sessions which are on par with your current ability. So obviously, yeah, you feel like you're a bit tired, but you still feel like this training program is sustainable. On the other hand, if you're in this red zone here, then you're probably always feeling quite tired. Your legs are always feeling heavy. Training sessions are always an effort, and actually you'll be quite hit and miss with your training sessions. Some of them might go really well, but then you might have some really bad ones. And that's a sign that actually you're not recovering, that there's too much fatigue and you probably need to back off. And another good way of measuring where you are in your training load is actually, are you getting better? If your performances are consistently getting better, you're consistently doing better and better training sessions, then the training's working. You're adapting to that training, you're getting a really good adaptive response. So that's a good place to be. But if you find that you're stagnating, or actually your performance is getting worse, then actually there's a good chance that you're overdoing it. You're doing too much training and you need to ease off on the training loads. And it's always best to be cautious with increasing training loads, especially if it's to a training load you haven't done before. And it's much better to increase it slowly, because actually, if we start like here on the curve, so midway up the curve, and then we suddenly keep ramping the training up without holding it at a steady state, then we could quite easily overshoot this blue line completely and end up in the reds or further along on this curve. But if we increase it slowly, so for example, a runner does 60 miles a week with 2 hard sessions, and they increase it to 70 miles a week with 2 hard sessions, the same similar sessions, then we can, if we hold them there at that volume for a bit and see how they respond, if performances increase and we seem to be coping well with this training load, then maybe there's scope to increase it a little bit further. On the other hand, if that seems to negatively affect their performance and there's excessive fatigue, then maybe just back it down to 65 or 60 miles. That's just an example. So now we're going to wrap it all together, building a training schedule. So this is encompass some of the knowledge we talked about in both part 1 and part 2 of this webinar. Hopefully you remember that between 80 and 90% of the training should be at easy intensity, so zone 1 and zone 2, with 10 to 20% being a high intensity, or harder intensity. So that's about the zone 3, the zone 4, the zone 5, the zone 6 training sessions. So that's above the lactate threshold. But how do we distribute this over the course of a week, and how do we manage that balance between stress and recovery? So I'm going to work through 2 examples, and I'm going to talk you through how I've decided to structure the training, and hopefully it's a good example of the thinking that you need, the things you should be thinking about when you're designing your own training or the training for your athletes. So this first example, we've got a good club level runner. Let's say he's a 16-minute 5K runner. He's been training for 3 or 4 years, so he's not a novice, but he's not a really experienced either. They're training 6 times a week. So Monday, we've got 60 minutes easy, zone 1. Tuesday, we're doing 6 times 5 minutes in zone 4 with 60 seconds recovery. So this is just above the lactate turn point. It's a really good way of improving the lactate turn point, because we're going to be generating some lactate, but sustaining a moderate lactate for an extended period of time. So for 30 minutes, lactate will be elevated past their lactate turn point. And we're working reasonably hard. Heart rate could be up to 90% of max, but we're not going flat out. This isn't actually that stressful a session. Despite doing a good amount of work, actually, most of the time they're within themselves. And if you're a well-trained runner, you could do up to an hour's worth of this work. So you could do 10 times 5 minutes with 60 seconds recovery. So this runner doing 6 times 5 minutes between 85 and 90% of heart rate max is stressful, but it's not really stressful. It's not really hard. It's reasonably comfortable. And because of that, we only need 2 easy days after that session. So Wednesday, we're going to do 60 minutes easy, below the lactate threshold, really comfortable. And then Thursday, we're going to do 40 minutes easy, but because Tuesday wasn't that stressful, we're going to include some zone 6 stuff. So we're going to do 6 times 15-second hills with a walk back recovery. So this is zone 6. Is really good for power, speed, and economy, and that's really important for everybody. Whatever event you're doing, whether that be the 800 meters of a marathon, it's really good to improve some stuff to develop your power and your economy. And because the zone 6 stuff isn't that stressful, we're only doing 6 times 15 seconds. The recovery from that is also short, so we can do a hard session the next day. So on Friday, we're going to do a zone 5 session, and this is a VO2 max type session. Heart rate and oxygen consumption are nearly at maximum values. We're doing 4 times 3 minutes with 2 minutes recovery. So despite only doing 12 minutes of work, this is actually quite a lot more stressful than the Tuesday session. we're going really, really hard. We're going to generate lots of lactate. We're going to have a lot of adrenaline, a lot of cortisol going around the system. And because of that, Saturday is going to be our rest day. So our rest day is going to happen after our hardest session of a week, which is going to allow lots of time for adaptation, for recovery, for some of that fatigue to go away, and for his training adaptations to take place. And then Sunday, we've got 90 minutes easy, zone 1. And then we get another easy day. If we're going to follow this program for next week, we have another easy day on Monday before we go again on Tuesday. So that means that after our hardest session of the week, we've got 3 easy days to recover and absorb that training, and with one of them being a rest day. And if we look at the overall volume of a program, we've got 4 hours, 50 minutes of easy running, or 87%. So that's nicely within our ratio. And 43.5 minutes of harder running. So that's zone 3, zone 4, zone 5, zone 6 intensities. So we've got a nice distribution between hard and easy. And we've not done 2 sessions at zone 4. We've mixed up the stimulus. So we were doing some zone 4 work, some zone 5 work, and some zone 6 work within a week. So it's nice and varied, and you'd expect to get slightly different adaptations from that. So we're going to get a nice, well-rounded athlete. So the zone 4 stuff is going to help improve their lactate threshold, which is predictive of your 1 hour performance and race time. We've got a 4 by 3 minutes with 2 minutes recovery, zone 5 session. So it's just going to help improve our VO2 max. So that's a maximum amount of oxygen we can breathe in and use within our muscles. And then we've got some power stuff with the zone 6 to, as I said, to develop power, speed, and economy. So that's an example of a good club level runner. Next, we've got a 218 marathon runner as our example, and I'll be honest, this is a schedule that I've pulled just out of a week of training that I did just before I ran a 218 marathon. This is my last hard week before I had a 2-week taper. So hopefully I should be able to explain this pretty well. I started with 12 miles on Monday, so 6:30 a mile, but actually 6:30 a mile at that speed, for me, that's about a heart rate of 130. And my lactate threshold happens at 150, about 150 and 155 beats per minute. So my heart rate was at 130 on this run. And that means that I'm well away from the lactate threshold. I'm not going to be going with any risk of going too hard. It's a nice, comfortable session. Tuesday, 6 miles easy in the morning. And then in the afternoon, I did a zone 4, zone 5 session. So I did 2 times 3K, 3 times 2K, 4 times 1K, starting off at the zone 4 speed and then moving down to a zone 5 speed. So 2:58 a kilometer for me it's not quite 5K pace. It's not quite as fast as that, but it's faster than 10K pace. So I've been working at quite a high proportion of my heart rate max and my oxygen consumption, but without going all the way. And I've done 16K or 10 miles of work. So this is quite a stressful session. I've got a good volume and intensity is from zone 4 to zone 5. So from tempo up to VO2 max. So this is quite a stressful session, and hence I've taken 3 easy days afterwards. 15 miles easy on the Wednesday. So although it's 15 miles, it's still at a nice comfortable intensity, and because I've got a long training history, I know that I can do that sort of session and still recover in time for my next hard session. So Thursday was a double day, 6 miles, again, nice and easy, and then 10 miles easy in the afternoon, but I've included some zone 6 stuff, so 10 times 15 second hills with a walk back recovery, just to help maintain that turnover, that power and the economy side. And then I've taken a really easy day on the Friday to make sure I'm fully recovered for Saturday's session, which was probably the hardest session I did of my whole marathon training block. I did a couple of miles warm up, and I did 22 miles at 5:18 a mile, which for me was marathon pace. and then a couple of miles easy afterwards. So here my lactate would be in a zone 3 value. So it'd been above my lactate thresholds, but below my lactate turn point. This is really good for, it's obviously, it turns out being exactly race pace for me. So it's going to get me used to running at that pace. It's good for promoting fatigue resistance at that pace, making sure my muscles are conditioned for the pounding that's going to happen when you run 22 miles at a fast pace. So hopefully get me conditioned enough for the marathon, and help me, it will help improve my lactate thresholds. I'm working just above it. And it's going to help me become more economical at that pace. Hopefully I'll burn a little bit more fat and less glycogen. And then Sunday is probably my easiest day of the whole week, although it's 10 miles. Again, really comfortable pace. And so again, my easiest day has corresponded with the day after my hardest session. And then the rest, you can't see the rest of this week on here because the next week, but I had 3 really easy days after this 22-mile run, and my next session was only a moderate session. It wasn't a really stressful session. I think I did 20 minutes of a minute fast, a minute jog, and without pushing it too much. And that was basically the start of my taper. And then if you look at the duration, 9 hours and 15 minutes was at a really comfortable, easy intensity. So that was a heart rate below 155. And then 2 hours and 45 minutes was hard. So it was 79% and 21%. So just outside of the 80-20, but a percentage point either way is not gonna make much difference. The principle is the same, but most of my training was easy, with a smaller proportion of it being hard. So that sort of brings us to the end. I've got some take-home messages. This is my pyramid of importance, basically. The base of our pyramid is training frequency and total volume. As I said in the first webinar, training volume is one of the biggest predictors of performance, and a great way to get volume is training frequency. So if you're new to running, the best way to add more running is with frequency. So instead of doing 5 runs a week, we do 6 runs a week. Once you're comfortable doing 6 runs a week, we can start doing some double days. So yeah, that's a really good starting point if we can get a good training frequency and a good training volume. And then obviously we're going to need to do some high intensity training, and using the high intensity zones of the zone 3, zone 4, zone 5, zone 6 zones. And to get a nice well-rounded athlete, it's probably good to use a mixture of these different training zones, especially an athlete who's reasonably well trained. Using all the zones is going to lead to distinct training adaptations, which are going to help improve performance. So for a minute, we've got a good volume with some high intensity. And then the next most important thing is getting that stress and recovery balance right. So making sure we've got enough easy days after our hard sessions, and that actually across the whole week, across the whole program, 80 to 90% of our training is easy, and then 10 to 20% is harder. And everything else is really the icing on the cake. These are the 3 things that are the most important for any athlete. If you can get these right, you're going to be 90% of the way to designing a successful training program or a successful training schedule. Everything else, yeah, it's important. There are things that are important, pacing strategies, race-specific work, but actually getting those 3, these basic points right are really important. And a lot of people skip over these sort of things, especially the stress and recovery side of it, and go straight to the exciting things, the icing on the cake. So to summarize and to finish off then, the rules should be build some volume, some of it hard, but most of it easy. Don't stress too much about everything else. Okay, and that brings us to our Q&A section now. So I'm just going to look through your questions that you've been sending in, and I'll do my best to answer them. Apologies, but I will be